thank you, Liam from Buglife, who's going to be talking through all interesting things about spotting wheel beetles along the coast. So thank you, Liam.
Yeah. So yeah, thank you very much for having me along. So my name's Liam, and I'm Conservation Officer at Buglife, the Invertebrate Conservation Trust. So I'm just going to touch on oil beetles in Pembrokeshire, and Vicky's talk earlier touched on the fascinating life cycle and stuff. So I'll go on into that in a bit more detail, as well as the identification of oil beetles, some of the places you can look for them in Pembrokeshire, and then touch on their conservation and recording as well. So firstly, what are oil beetles? So they're insects, so they've got the three-part body, which is a head, a thorax and an abdomen, and 3 pairs of legs. They belong to a family within the beetles called Meloe, of which we have 11 UK species. 3 have gone extinct, so that's left us with 8. And 5 of them are what we call our true oil beetles, so the ones sort of like pictured here, the typical oil beetle. And then we also have 3 additional species as well that are in the family, but they don't really look like oil beetles. So these are, you've got the yellow-shouldered blister beetle on the left, you've got the IVB beetle on the bottom right, which is only found in the Channel Islands, and then you've got Spanish fly as well in the top right, which is largely down on the Isle of Wight. So this talk is really going to focus on the true oil beetles and not these 3 species. So the reason behind the oil beetle name is what Vicky said earlier, is the fact that when oil beetles are threatened, they exude an oily substance from their joints, and this is an anti-predator technique. So this is a foul-tasting chemical, so it's a way of deterring predators from eating the oil beetle. And quite interestingly, this oil contains a compound called Cantharidin, which is a really desirable compound to a number of different insect species. So you've got pictured on the left there, you've got a load of biting midges that are all trying to access the oil around this violet oil beetle here. And they're trying to take up this Cantharidin, and it's used again as an anti-predator technique. So the midges are trying to take it up as a way of protecting themselves from being consumed by other animals. And then you've got on the right there is a male cardinal beetle who's biting an oil beetle, and again trying to get access to that oil which contains this Cantharidin compound. And interestingly, the female cardinal beetles will only mate with males that have got good quantities of this Cantharidin compound. And it's passed, I believe, from the males to the females in the sperm, and then she uses it then as a coating on her egg and as a way of protecting her eggs from being predated. And it's also got antifungal properties as well. So this is quite a rare observation to see these cardinal beetles biting oil beetles, but a few lucky individuals do see them every other year. And oil beetles have got the most fascinating life cycle, I think, of perhaps any of our British beetles. So I'm just going to kind of touch on that now. So firstly, the life cycle sort of starts really with the oil beetles emerging from sort of from their larval burrows, I suppose. So on emergence, their abdomens tend to be very small, and they sort of hardly protrude from underneath the wing cases. So you can see in this image here, this is a violet oil beetle that's just recently emerged. You can see the large wing cases, and the abdomen isn't swollen in the typical way that they normally are in oil beetles. But after feeding, the abdomen then begins to fill out and take on the sort of typical oil beetle shape. So when oil beetles first emerge, that's when they can cause a little bit of confusion with other beetles, things like bloody nose beetles and that sort of thing. But when they take the typical oil beetle shape, then they're quite distinctive. And then important food plants for the adults are things like lesser celandine, various soft grasses as well, dandelions, which are generally just great for all sorts of insects, buttercups, hawkbits as well. But there's still a lot to be learned really about the important food plants of the adults as well. And you can see in this image here, this is the same beetle 24 hours after emerging. So you can see that this female is sort of fed up now and her abdomen is swollen. And when they're like this, then they're quite distinctive beetles and shouldn't really be confused with many other insects. So once they've sort of emerged and sort of started feeding, then they got to look for mates. So that's when you get the courtship and mating. So you've got a mating pair here of violet oil beetles. And then after after mating, then the female has got to look for nest laying sites. And this is where they come into sort of frequent contact with us as we're exploring the countryside, because the females are looking for areas of bare ground and ideally compacted soil as well. So this is where they typically use footpaths, and the Welsh coast path is probably the best place to really go looking for oil beetles, and particularly the Pembrokeshire coast, really good for black oil beetles, and in a few locations violet oil beetles as well. So they're really nice beetle to look for, because you can just look for the adults in the springtime, excavating the nest burrows, or just generally sort of feeding and stuff beside the footpath. And the females will try to excavate as many different nests as she can, and she'll lay perhaps up to about 1,000 eggs in each of these nest burrows. And the reason she's sort of laying so many eggs is just because so few of them actually make it to adulthood, because the interesting life cycle they've got. So as Vicky also said earlier, the first stage of the oil beetle's life really is as a triungulate. So this is the first larval stage of the oil beetle. So the nest burrows, you have the females excavating the nest burrow, she lays her eggs. The eggs hatch into these triungulates, which are sort of long-legged and rather louse-like. And these triungulates then have got to sort of make their way up onto flowers. And these are sort of 5 true oil beetle species in the UK. Of which we get 3 species in Pembrokeshire, and you can see the triungulates are all different to one another, and they're quite distinctive as well. And it's actually easier to identify the triungulates than it is the adults quite often as well. So the violet oil beetles triungulates are perhaps our most distinctive on the far left, because they're black, and they're also our largest, still only 2 millimeters long, so they're still small, but bigger than some of the others. The triungulates you're most likely to see on the Pembrokeshire coast are going to be the triungulates of the black oil beetle, which is the next one along, which are sort of yellow-orange and about 1.5 millimeters long. And then you've got our 3 sort of rarest species then. You've got our rugged, going left to right, you've got rugged oil beetle triungulates. Then you've got the short-necked oil beetle triungulate, which is the other species that's found in Pembrokeshire and really rare. And then you've got the Mediterranean, then it's not found in Wales, but it's down on the south coast of England. So these triungulates then are really active, and they sort of climb up flowers, and they sort of sit on the flower heads, and they're waiting for solitary bees to come along. So you've got image on the left here has got a nice sort of black oil beetle triungulate sort of on the flower there, a little bit harder to spot. This doesn't contrast as well as the sort of violet oil beetle triungulates on the right there, which are being black and contrasting against the dandelion that's on are a bit more obvious. But you can see large numbers of them gather on the flowers, and they're effectively just waiting then for a solitary bee to come along. And they've got these specialized little sort of claws on the front legs, and they use that then to attach themselves to a solitary bee. So the solitary bee visits a flower to get pollen and nectar, and the little triungulate just grabs hold tight and hopes to sort of hitch a ride then back to the nest. And you can see on the image on the left, you've got a number of violet oil beetle triungulates that are all sort of concentrated, hiding at the back of the thorax there, hoping to get back to the nest. And if they're lucky enough to make it back to the nest, so firstly, they've got to attach themselves to a female solitary bee, because they're the ones that are creating the nests. That's their first challenge. And then they've got to make sure that they perhaps get on the right species of solitary bee that they're associated with. And assuming all of that goes right and they make it back to a nest, then they go then from stage A, which is the triungulate stage, and then they go into a typical sort of beetle grub then and go through various stages before eventually sort of pupating underground and emerging as an adult oil beetle the next year. And what they're doing in the solitary bee nest is that they're eating the pollen and nectar stores that the solitary bee intended to provide for her own offspring. So they're sort of cuckoos in effect. So they're bad news for the solitary bees, but they are really important little beetles, and they of course do indicate healthy populations of solitary bees. So they're quite useful like that. And unfortunately, a large number of these triungulates don't make it because they get on the wrong sort of insect. So on the left here, you can see there's a large number of black oil beetle triungulates, the orange ones, all clustered on a solitary wasp. And unfortunately, these triungulates are doomed because the solitary wasp won't have pollen and nectar in the nest for them to feed on. And a lot of these triangulates will just attach themselves to anything that visits a flower, whether that's hoverflies or bumblebees or anything really. So they've basically just got to be really lucky that a female solitary bee of the right sort of species is visiting that flower and they can get back to the nest. But against all odds, there's so many triangulates that just a small minority will sort of make it through to adulthood and become the sort of typical oil beetle that we see on the right there. So that's a sort of amazing sort of life cycle of oil beetles. And now coming on to the species that we sort of get in Pembrokeshire. So Pembrokeshire has 3 of our 4 Welsh species, and all of the species that are found in Pembrokeshire are daytime spring active species. So they're active at the moment, so from sort of March, April, May through to about June. And these species are the black oil beetle, which are in the bottom left, which is the one that's most frequently seen in Pembrokeshire. Then you've got the violet oil beetle, bottom middle, which is a little bit scarcer, but you get it on some of the north coasts of Pembrokeshire. And then the rarest one, which is also one of the rarest oil beetles in the UK, is the short-necked oil beetle, which I'll come on to later on. So I'm just going to go through each of these species and talk briefly about their identification features to start with. So starting with the black oil beetle, so as I mentioned, this is the species that's most frequently seen in Pembrokeshire and really quite common on the coastline of Pembrokeshire. So if you're walking along the coast path and see an oil beetle, it's more than likely going to be a black oil beetle. Active from about sort of mid-February, sometimes in quite mild sort of winters, through to about June. As I mentioned, predominantly coastal. They're about 3 centimeters long, so they're quite big beetles. And they have this square-shaped thorax, so the middle part of the body is square, which is important for identification because only 2 of our oil beetle species have a square-shaped thorax. The males have these kinked antennae, so it's really easy to sex them. So you've got a male on the left here, and he's got like this really quite obvious bend in his antennae. So one of the segments in the middle there is a slightly different shape to the other. So it sort of like throws the antennae out in a different direction. So if you see in this sort of kink in the antennae, then it's a male. The female on the right there, all the segments are sort of the same size and shape, and there's no obvious kink. It's like slight bend, but not obvious. So that's how you sex them. And with these, the triangulates hatch within a few weeks. And they're active in about June and July, so you can look for the triangulates in these months on flowers after the oil beetles have sort of disappeared, the adults. And this is a sort of typical sort of habitat you get, so a Pembrokeshire coast path, so you've got the nice bare ground, compacted soil where the females will excavate their nest burrows, and this is where they quite often get trodden on and squished and stuff, which is quite sad. But then to the right then you've got a nice patch of celandines. So this is where the females will obviously eat the grasses and the celandines themselves, but the triangulates will use the celandines then and the other wildflowers as a platform then to get onto solitary bees. So it's about having the sort of bare ground in combination with the flowers is really important for oil beetles. And this map shows the sort of general kind of distribution of oil beetles. So they found right across Great Britain, but predominantly sort of in the southwest of England and the Welsh coast, and you can see Pembrokeshire sort of glowing with records there. It's a really important place for black oil beetle. And then coming on to the violet oil beetle, so this is another species active at the same sort of time of year. You can get it on the coast, particularly in Pembrokeshire, but as a general rule for Wales, it's usually found more inland and associated with sort of woodland edge sort of habitats. But as I mentioned, you can still get it in meadows and on coastal footpaths as well. The eggs of these take about a year to hatch. So the triangulates that you'll see at this time of year have actually been produced by the adults from the previous year. So they don't hatch within like a few months like the black oil beetle triangulates do. Again, the same sort of size as the black oil beetle, again has a square-shaped thorax. So only our black and violet oil beetles have that square-shaped thorax. And again, the males have got these strongly kinked antennae, which the image on the right here really shows that strong kink. So this is clearly a male, and then the female on the left there. And the violet oil beetle, this is a sort of typical habitat that I would think of. So you've got a footpath, so you've got the bare ground again, and compacted soil for the nest burrows. And this footpath is going through the edge of woodland, and you'll have sort of woodland flowers like celandines again, dandelions and other things as well that the triangulates will use. And you can see the distribution is a bit more patchy with the violet oil beetle, so it's not quite as common as the black oil beetle. It's generally found in the west of Britain, so southwest of England, parts of Wales, northern England and Scotland as well. And this is sort of map shows the distribution of black and violet oil beetle across Pembrokeshire. It's not probably entirely accurate, but you can sort of see the general distribution. You can see the black oil beetle in the yellow boxes are found pretty much throughout much of the Pembrokeshire on the coast, a little bit inland as well. So you might be able to see areas that that you live and can look for oil beetles. And no doubt they're sort of in areas in between some of these dots as well. And then in blue are some of like the squares that have got records of violet oil beetle, and there will be some more blue ones as well, because there'll be an overlap with some of these squares having both species. But you can see that it's generally, there's quite good areas, if you can see my little arrow. So this sort of area is quite good for violet oil beetle along the coastline, this area as well here. So usually the sort of north coast of Pembrokeshire tends to have the more sort of violet oil beetles, and in this area here as well. So again, more towards the Preseli Hills as well. And unfortunately, our black and violet oil beetles are our most common oil beetle species in Pembrokeshire and indeed across the whole of the UK. But their identification is quite challenging, and they do look superficially very similar. But the key really is to get a really good, clear view of the thorax, or that middle part of the body, and it's to do with like the shape of the thorax. So one useful thing is looking at the basal margin of the thorax. So it tends to be almost straight in black oil beetle, whereas in violet oil beetle it tends to be more V-shaped, it's a bit more sort of indented. Another key thing then really is looking sort of below the thorax to this area here. And there's very small, or if not no tuft at all in the black oil beetle, whereas in the violet oil beetle you have this large tuft sort of underneath the thorax. So if you can get a clear sort of view and see a large tuft, then you kind of know you're looking at a violet oil beetle. And then the violet oil beetle has a number of different characteristics that are really distinctive as well. So it has these sort of depressions in the base of the thorax, so it's sort of like as though it's been sort of indented a bit, sort of like chiseled out, which the black oil beetle doesn't have. And you can also look at the punctures as well, which might take a little bit more practice, but the punctures on the thorax tend to be sort of larger and deeper, sort of in the black oil beetle, so they're coarser, whereas in the violet they tend to be quite fine and more shallow as well. And the colour as well is something they should point out, in that it's not always reliable, but usually the black oil beetles are black and the violet have a violetty sheen, but you can get individuals that go either way with both species as well. So you can't entirely rely on colour, but it can be a useful indicator as well. But just try and get a clear view as you can of the top down, and if you can get an image as well, then it allows somebody like myself then to confirm then which species it is. And then the final oil beetle species that you get in Pembrokeshire is the short-necked oil beetle, which is a really rare species, really rare across the whole of the UK. Again, it's a spring active species in the same sort of time of year, and is sort of the habitats it's associated with are quite unusual. So it's a mixture of sites. So it uses things like coastal grassland, which is what it's using in Pembrokeshire. Then it uses things like sand dunes in some places, heathland as well. It has a very western distribution, so it's generally the southwest of England, Wales, Ireland, and northern sort of Scotland. It's a smaller species than the others, so it's about sort of 24 millimeters, about 2.5 centimeters in length. But it's a very distinctive species. So it's got this rectangular shaped thorax, whereas in the other species it was square. So that's one thing. The smaller size as well. It's also like rather shiny, so you can see the shininess here, and it's sort of blue-black in colour. And the antennae are quite distinctive as well, because they're very small little segments, and the antennae are straight as well. It's not easy to sex them because the males and females don't have like the kinks in the antennae, so that's a bit more challenging. But it's really one to look out for in Pembrokeshire, because it was recently found by Annie Haycock, which some of you might know, and it was the first time she found that really rather recently, I suppose, in the last 5 years, and it was the first record of the short-necked oil beetle in Wales since about 1944, and at the moment is our only known population in Wales. So there will be a lot more survey work in the future years to try to find out about more about this species, but she found it down on the sort of Castle Martin Peninsula. But if you're out walking, really do keep an eye out for the short-necked orbital, and hopefully you can sort of find more sites for it. And this map just kind of shows this distribution. So you can see that the dark green spots are where the current populations are. So there's very few populations. You've got one down in sort of Devon, another in Salisbury Plain area. You've got the Pembrokeshire population, and then you've got one on the east coast of Ireland, and another then up on the Outer Hebrides of Scotland. So very, very rare species. So as has been touched on earlier, oil beetles are dependent upon the health and diversity of wild bees, and declines in our wild bees have resulted in declines in oil beetle populations. And unfortunately, 3 of our 8 sort of true oil beetle species have now gone extinct. And our remaining 5 species, of which you get 3 in Pembrokeshire, have all suffered really drastic declines. And as a result, oil beetles are considered a priority for conservation. And you can go about looking for either the adults by looking on the footpaths, which are probably the easiest things, or you can keep an eye out for the triangles on the flowers as well. And I really ask if, I know I'm running out of time here, but if you see any oil beetles, it's really important that you submit your records. And then that can be used to inform conservation on the ground. So the sort of things we need are things like the date that you've seen the oil beetle, the location, and ideally a 6 to 8 figure reference. You can get using a number of free apps or Grid Reference Finder, which is a free website, your name, where you was, and perhaps most importantly, a photograph then, so it allows us to confirm then what species you've seen, which is really important when separating the black and the violet oil beetle. And there's a new oil beetle recording scheme set up. So if you look at the website, sort of coleoptera.org, I think it is, and you can sort of find out more about the oil beetle recording scheme. And it's quite important that the records go there. If you use Twitter, there's Oil Beetles UK as well. You can follow them, who can help with identification as well. But when it comes to submitting records, the records of the Oil Beetle recording scheme gather are from iRecord. So if you can either submit your records direct to iRecord, or if you use sort of the LERC Wales app, which is the one for all the record centres in Wales, then they automatically go to iRecord, so you can pick up the records for the recording scheme from there. And the West Wales Biodiversity Information Centre have also got their own sort of recording website, and records submitted there will also go to iRecord as well. So any of these 3 means of recording will all get the records to the recording scheme. So that's really good. Out and about, there's a Buglife guide to oil beetles, which is free from the Buglife website. It covers all of the 5 species and the 3 that are found in Pembrokeshire. So do check that out. And that's all I can say, is really kind of get out there and kind of look for oil beetles, and hopefully gather some records and send them into the recording scheme. So thank you very much for that.